In this video, we're going to talk about social cognition. Social cognition is the area of psychology that examines how people perceive and think about their social world. As I mentioned in a previous video, people have schematic representations of their world. This means that we form mental representations of things in order to figure out what to do. We have schemas about ourselves, about other people, about physical objects, and about events. Some types of schemas are referred to as scripts, or mental models of sequences of events. A good example of this would be the restaurant script. When you go to a restaurant for the first time, like one that you've never been to before, you have an idea about how it's going to go. You have a script, a blueprint for what to expect, given that you've been to other types of restaurants before. So you know that when you go in, you'll be seated, you'll look at a menu, you'll order food, and you'll eat at your leisure and pay at the end. And if you're generous, then you'll leave a good tip, except if you're in one of the cities where they're outlawing tipping. But anyway, you know how it's going to go because you have had those experiences and you have an idea in your mind already, even if you've never been to that particular restaurant before. So in this sense, schemas and schematic representations of the world really help us. They help us to live life more efficiently. It would be really maladaptive if you had to relearn how restaurants work every time you went to someplace new, because they all function in a very similar way. In a sense, while schemas are useful to us in that they make life more efficient, they also make it more likely for us to cut corners as a way to process information faster. People often use heuristics, which are mental shortcuts that reduce complex thinking to more simple rule-based decisions. I mentioned some heuristics in a previous video. We looked at the beautiful equals good heuristic and the expensive equals better heuristic. Here's two other types of heuristics that are described in your textbook. The first is called the representativeness heuristic. How do you know that a Great Dane and a Chihuahua are both dogs? To answer this, you might use the representativeness heuristic. Rather than engaging in an in-depth examination of something's attributes or properties, you can simply estimate the likelihood of something belonging to a category based on the extent to which it appears similar to your mental representation of that category. If it looks like your idea of a dog, and it barks like your idea of a dog, and it moves like what your idea of a dog is, then it's probably a dog. With the availability heuristic, you might ask yourself why so many people are comfortable driving in cars, but feel nervous to fly in airplanes, despite the fact that car accidents happen all the time and airplane crashes are extremely rare. This can be explained by the availability heuristic, which allows for us to estimate the frequency or likelihood of an event based on how easily instances of it come to mind. More commonly occurring events are more likely to be cognitively available, leading to relatively good approximations of frequency. But sometimes we have less common or rare things that are more memorable in terms of events, and they distort our availability heuristic by emphasizing apparent significance over actual frequency. Dying in plane crashes are very rare to occur, but people may overestimate their occurrence because plane crashes tend to be very highly memorable. Now, I'd like to do an exercise with you. Think of a personal short-term goal that you would like to achieve for yourself. And hopefully this is something that you can achieve within the next few weeks or maybe the next few months. Doesn't matter when. It could be sometime before the end of the summer, or maybe in the fall before the year ends, or maybe within the year. So now I'd like you to write down 3 dates. The first is going to be the date that you estimate you will finish by. So maybe if it's a summer goal, you'll estimate finishing by the end of August, and you would write down August 30th. Now I want you to write down the best case finish point. So assuming that everything goes according to plan and things go smoothly, then maybe you'll finish a bit earlier than your estimate. So maybe you'll finish by mid-August instead of the end. So maybe your best case finish point would be August 15th. Now, the last one I want you to write down is your worst case finish point. So this is what would happen if everything goes wrong. You hit every possible obstacle you can imagine, and the worst case finish point in this case may be a couple of weeks after the original estimate, and it would be September 15th. Okay, so take a second, pause the video, write down your goal and those 3 dates. Now, what's the point of this exercise? Well, when researchers study people who write down a goal and then those 3 dates, they find that a majority of participants miss even their own worst case finish point. That is, it takes longer than the 3rd date people write down, where everything goes wrong in a majority of cases for people to accomplish their goals. So the conclusion of this is that everything always takes longer than you think, and this is referred to as the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy happens in part because we're too optimistic. Now, optimism is good. We like optimism. In fact, optimism is associated with well-being. But what happens is that it distorts our thinking about what could happen that would make us fail. We don't include possible failures in our estimates of when and how well we will get things done. So a good way to counteract this optimism bias and to overcome the planning fallacy is to try imagining that we will fail and really vividly imagining ourselves failing in the near future. So think, what went wrong? Now we can plan around those failures. Affective forecasting is another way in which our estimates for the future lead us astray. Affective forecasting is basically how we make predictions about what will happen emotionally in the future. It's kind of like weather forecast. We want to know if it's going to be sunny or if it's going to rain. And we also want to know if we're going to feel happy or sad based on the events that will happen to us in the future. And it turns out that when it comes to affective forecasting, we're actually pretty good at identifying what emotions we'll feel in response to events. So this would be analogous to being accurate whether it's going to be sunny or rainy or snowy, etc. So we know if something's going to make us sad or angry or happy, but we tend to overestimate the intensity of the emotional experience and how long it will last. These are referred to as impact bias and durability bias. Impact bias is the tendency to overestimate the intensity of future feelings, and durability bias is a tendency to overestimate how positive and negative effects will last. It turns out that we tend to overestimate how long things will last because we underestimate our ability to adapt and respond to circumstances and kind of turn back to our emotional baseline. Another explanation for things like the planning fallacy and affective forecasting is that we're making estimates not just based on what we feel is likely, but also based on what we're wanting or craving. Based on these underlying emotions and motivations, we convince ourselves of things that aren't actually accurate. In another video, I discussed the idea of motivated reasoning. Motivated skepticism is a similar idea that's discussed in your textbook. Sometimes it's studied by asking people how they judge the accuracy of certain kinds of information and how receptive people are to those kinds of information. In some cases, researchers will give people false feedback on things like an intelligence or personality test. So imagine you're in one of these studies and the researchers say, we're going to measure your personality traits and your intelligence and then give you feedback. Except participants are not given actual feedback. They're randomly assigned to be told positive things about them or negative things. But here's the result. When people are told positive things, they accept them pretty much without question and move on. But when people get negative information, then they become more skeptical. Then they start questioning the methods and materials that were used, and maybe they list other types of mitigating circumstances, like they didn't get a good night's sleep before, and that's why they scored poorly. This also happens when people are going to the doctor and they get actual medical feedback about their health in terms of their behaviors, and in some cases, diagnoses. People, when they get positive feedback, when they get good news from the doctor that they're healthy and that their lifestyles are good, tend to accept those facts without question. When people receive bad news from the doctor, then they start to get skeptical and they start to derogate the procedures, in some cases demanding follow-up tests and downplaying the significance as if they don't have to change anything about their lifestyle. Toward the end of your textbook chapter on this unit, there is some discussion about the concept of automaticity, as well as hot cognition and social priming. Full disclosure, I'm not going to test you on any of this content because I'm not convinced that these ideas are valid and that the research findings are replicable. There's a lot of controversy around these ideas of automatic thought processes related to social behaviors. Now, to be clear, I think there's definitely validity to the idea that we have mental associations, and those are well established in the field of cognitive psychology. So, to give an example, if I say knife and you think fork, that's robust and replicable. If I say table and you think chair, more than you would think armadillo, that's also replicable. We have cognitive associations in our minds. But social psychologists in the past couple of decades have tried to make the case that those automatic associations in our minds are related to downstream social behaviors. So going back to the cognitive example, if I say fork and you think knife, that doesn't mean you're going to pick up a knife and stab somebody. That would be ridiculous. And yet, social psychologists have tried to make that case. They've tried to say that the automatic connections in our thought processes predict real-world behavior. I am not convinced that that is true, and I think a lot of the failures to replicate prior studies have come from this line of research on social cognition and social priming. So social priming based on automatic cognitive connections, I don't think is a replicable idea. So go ahead and read through the chapter portion on automaticity if you like. I'm not going to test you on it. One other thing that I'll say about social attitudes, which is related to our discussion on the previous slide about automaticity and social priming, is about social attitudes. And your textbook, once again, I think gets it half right. There's a good discussion about the differences and similarities between explicit and implicit attitudes, as well as the idea of the implicit association test, which is one of the more popular measures of implicit attitudes. In particular, it's become popular as a way of uncovering implicit bias or implicit prejudice. In some sense, our attitudes are a type of bias that predispose us to responses that are positive or negative. For example, if we don't like sushi, we're likely to avoid sushi restaurants and avoid thinking about sushi. That's a pretty obvious and intuitive thing. But with our social world, there's so many different associations that we have, and not all of them are consistent with each other. So the implicit association test, which is described in your textbook as this kind of automatic game that you play on a computer where you press keys on a keyboard as fast as you can, ostensibly reveals an automatic association you might have in terms of stereotypes and biases towards social groups. But at the same time, we might have negative biases towards social groups. We also have positive ideas in our mind about fairness and justice and concern for others' welfare. So that's why the IAT, in my opinion, doesn't reliably predict prejudicial behavior. In fact, there's a nice study where people were given the IAT and then were put into a situation where they were playing what's called the dictator game, where they received some resource and had to distribute it. And that person they were playing with was either a member of their social group or a different social group. IAT scores did not predict greater behavioral bias in those games played in the laboratory. So I'm not convinced that the IAT really tells us very much about prejudicial behavior, even though it might tell us something about prejudicial attitudes.